Thank you, everyone. Thank you, JNUTA. Thank you, all of you, for making time to come here. And it's a very special moment because I am sharing my research that has come out of a kind of journey from the age of 6 till recently, of dancing, learning, also analyzing, also critically trying to look at the same thing that has been my life or universe almost. So it's a very special moment. Thank you for giving me this. I would like to go through the PowerPoints first, just to kind of acquaint you with the things that I'm saying. Many of this is around a figure, a person who detested the word modern in his own dance, but actually did something that cannot be called anything but modern in his endeavor. He also was a figure who was actually placed in the 1920s in Europe as a student of Royal College of Art, going there as to train as an artist, but he turned into a dancer because there were less dancers and even less male dancers in that particular European space of that moment. And he was asked by Anna Pavlova. Many may have heard about this name. She was a Russian ballerina who was trying to establish himself in the Euro-American space anew. So she asked him to choreograph something, and that was his way into the dance world, and a total enchantment thereafter. So I wanted to show you certain sketches. I'm not sure if you see them very clearly. These are from the larger book, which is Alice Bonner collection, which is part of the Alice Bonner sculptor, a Swiss sculptor's collection, which is there in Museum Rietberg in Zurich. And they very kindly gave me this access to the collection and asked me to write a kind of special publication for the museum as a part of the series. And you can see that there was this man who is this is in 1926. This young man is trying to make certain sense of his body and movements that actually connects one point to the other, of moving the point from one side of his body to the other to try to imagine the points in between. That is what he was playing with to begin with, because he had to imagine how to move from point A to point B and connect the points. Because he was also a painter and he was sketching a lot. These points mattered. So therefore that connected Alice Bonner and Uday Shankar, and they actually began a journey together. And in this first book, I actually take up these kinds of very special moments that emerge out of Alice Bonner's documentations, where you see her having sketched, photographed and sculpted Uday Shankar. And in that moment, actually also fixing almost, or helping Shankar fix the pedagogy of the dance that he would later almost make like a grammar. And after this, you also see the way she documented in detail what Shankar was doing. So Shankar was actually cross-dressing and dancing. He was finding himself. He was gender fluid at that moment, though he never said that he was a heterosexual being or a kind of a person who was searching for other gender identities. But he was also doing movements that we never see him do in the later film that he made, where we document his mature movements, where he has already traveled from this experimental space to a space where he knows his movements, he knows the way in which he would teach the movements and his pedagogy. So he has traveled, but this documentation then gives us a glimpse of the past. It's also very important in that book was the connection that I could make with Alice Bonner's trying to Alice Bonner was a very, very well acknowledged sculptor, and also she wrote a lot of books on visual art history. And she was trying to imagine the sculptures with the centrifugal force and all the center of gravity that the sculpture actually needs, the sculpted body actually needs to stand in a perfect balance. And Uday Shankar continuously used those kinds of lines and played with them so that he could actually control his point of the way in which the balance would be held through the center of gravity. And that is something that we see in their work and her documentation continuously, when she figures out what he is doing when he is bending his head back and the body back while raising his leg on the other side, and how much of bending can then be adjusted within the body without losing the balance. So these kinds of movements actually creeped into Shankar's vocabulary. Now I come to the other book. This book actually kind of fed into the other book's archival work quite unexpectedly. I didn't know this archive existed, and through my journey through this book, I actually could get an idea of what I was expecting in terms of dance analysis. I knew the social story, I knew the history, the archive was giving me that, but dance analysis was not available to me. So this is the second book that has just been published, and I am talking mostly about this. I will read a short part from there, and these are the chapters. The chapters actually kind of divide Shankar's life in two parts. The first part is about 30 years, where Shankar emerges as the internationally known dance artist, choreographer, and a pedagogue. And he actually goes into a business venture as a kind of migrant dancer trying to find a route in a foreign space, foreign land. And he established a limited liability company registered in Paris with Alice Bonner. And then he actually went into he did his film in Kalpana, the only film, Kalpana, in 1948. That was released in 1948. Another very important thing that happened at that time was Shankar tried to establish, only for 5 years, in 1939, a modern dance institute, dance and other allied art institute in Almora, which closed down because of lack of funds. So I had certain questions. I have been part of Uday Shankar India Culture Center from childhood. I always found that there were a lot of things that were said by the international critics, and huge amount of admiration and acceptance, whereas the critiques from India, especially from the space of classical dances, have been hypercritical, dismissive about Shankar. So I kept on asking this question, that what was he doing that was threatening the whole structure of the emerging dance policy in the soon to be independent Indian cultural scenario. My other curiosity was that who was it inconveniencing through this whole denial of the Sanskrit-based system of learning Indian dance and Indian music. And also the other thing was that how did his highlighting of regional, vernacular and everyday representations threaten the upper caste claims of universal Sanskritic aesthetics for the recreated imaginations of the past, present, and the future of India. So it is a larger question which then gives me certain kinds of directions to read his life and the unanswered questions, which is that the dedication of Shankar within a small community of his admirers, the deification of Shankar within a small community of his admirers without exploring his idea of dance education and research lessens the significance of his contribution to build a modern, gender-equal institution. Nobody knows about Almora. Almora has not continued. Almora, after being given a land, was never receiving any government funds. Almora got funds from Dartington Hall, which was also funding Kalakshetra Foundation in the southern part of India, and also Rabindranath Tagore's university to begin with. But for one thing, Uday Shankar was not a business person at all, and secondly, he did not succeed in the war period during the Second World War to be able to kind of establish the institution so that it would be independently running without any input. It was a utopian dream for him. The second thing that bothers me constantly is that that every critique, including people like Kapila Vatsyayan, who had very little to do with Shankar's dance, would begin with, he never learned dance. So learning dance meant learning classical dances, belonging to a classical kind of genre. And he was never forgiven because of he was said to be an arrogant fusionist who wanted to just assimilate things together. And that he was able to be a good presenter, a healthy presenter, a wonderfully accepted presenter was never kind of forgiven. On the other hand, on the other side, what bothers me constantly is that there is a strange lack of political rigor in anything that he did. His dances were rhythms of India, so representation of folk dances, like just getting certain folk dances onto the stage and making them aesthetically presentable. He became this person who would talk about, who would actually train his dancers, who would be told that please don't talk politics when you are in public gathering. And this whole thing was happening when he started his troupe in 1930-31, and this was the post First World War scenario, but Europe was also again getting politically charged with with fascism rising as a bigger kind of presence every year, and he would stop people from discussing that in public realms and caution his dancers or musicians from and saying that you will not speak about all this. When he came back also, after that also his presentations remained apolitical. He never ever comments about the colonial masters, the presence of the colonial exploitations. He talks generally in Kalpana. If you have seen Kalpana, I don't know, it is available on YouTube as the full Michael Scorsese's, kind of remade version. The version that is available is absolutely like a new film, so you can see it. So you will see that there is a kind of a almost naive, simple engagement with dance and ideas that brush through problems but never take them on or never really kind of address them, as was being done parallelly by many theatre artists of the same time. So it is troubling to understand who he was, what was he functioning for, what was his motivation, what was his goal, and who was his intended audience. In a way, I kind of read a small section, a very, very small section now, just to make sense of the things that, I hope that you will read the book at some point to see that this dilemma configured through the chapters in the book. So, Shankar had, through his choreographic journey, clearly worked on the case of dance bodies to highlight a certain format of aesthetic of attitude, stance and movement of human bodies. The differences in embodiment due to social privilege and hierarchy, marginality, work, gender, emotions and specific circumstances of service by hierarchically lower humans to upper castes and classes were passed through as aesthetic and passed through an aesthetic lens to become an acceptable part of his choreographic vocabulary through pushing the ability of improvisation for each and every dancer. A part of Shankar's important legacy is perhaps to establish for the next generation of dancers the assimilation of the binary of the modern everyday movements vis-a-vis the imaginary iconographic representation of the sculptured bodies from history simultaneously. For his own dance, Shankar's representation of differential masculinities took as reference the socially formulated presence of gender binaries in a patriarchal society as inevitable outcomes of the gender, class, caste, religion-based segregations. The argument about authenticity and legitimacy was used against Shankar in a bid to control his indirect challenge to the one-way transmission of embodied knowledge in dance through the Guru-Shishya Parampara. Shankar's legacy, given space within the dance pedagogy, creates a space for a modern conversation around the rights to contextual references, transmission of knowledge, and cultural legitimacy beyond hierarchical and hereditary control. The improvisational process propagated by Shankar Das was to learn to look for cues such as images and motifs, alphabets, numbers, monuments, geometric shapes, and almost everything and anything that generated a kinesthetic possibility in the dancing body. Communicative gestures led by human emotions and the patterns of movement of all living and non-living presences in daily lives interested him. If anything, Shankar was opening up the possibilities of creating new ways of being inspired by one's surroundings. He was teaching his students to be able to imagine different ways of using these inspirations to create new movements while deliberately refraining from the exact reproduction or even identifiable representation of the original inspiration. As mentioned earlier, also, Shankar saw as his pedagogical base the use of dance as an individually nurtured expressive skill, a community expression, and embodying of ensemble identity. A large part of Shankar's work, continued by his students and his wife Amala, has been to establish the importance of ensemble practice and coming together in dance through a process of pooling in of artistic labor as a group and not as an individual dancer. In the classes, the dancer was taught to register the smallest of impulses from the ensemble he or she shared his or her artistic space with. Dancing could be an individual act or a group act, needing two very different kinds of agencies: effort, labor, and negotiations. The expression group feeling used by Zohra Sehgal, Narendra Sharma, and Amala Shankar is almost a legacy that is familiar to all the students who have been associated with Shankar. This is signifying a challenge of the hypersensitive state of moving together as a group, anticipating and almost knowing without watching what the group members would be doing next. The result is that each of the dancers in a group thinks of his or her dance as a contribution towards the building of their dance together. So I will show two small clips from the film Kalpana, but before that I just wanted to kind of begin introducing him, but the rest of the story of his life through these various stages, you will have to read the book to find out, I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say that most evaluations of Shankar's early career work attribute his fame to some Orientalist fascination of his Western audience of the late colonial times. For a handsome, good-looking man who is brown but not revoltingly so, a charming man, everyone agreed. His first experiment with choreography for Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova is viewed as more of a tableau than a dance. The trend of appropriation of dance and performance from the East was continuing in full force in the West. In fact, Anna Pavlova seemed to be doing the same thing when she invited Shankar to work with her. Shankar's writings and interviews often include gratitude for Anna Pavlova for inviting him to choreograph and dance with her. He saw this hierarchical collaborative process clearly as an achievement, and he remained grateful for the public visibility that his role as a dance partner, authenticator of Pavlova allowed him to be. So, and Shankar's, and then through life, actually he experimented with several things, moving away from just a kind of a tabloid kind of presentation to a presentation of ensemble critical choreographies with large spaces, with large groups of people, with elaborate rehearsal process and elaborate learning pedagogy. So, and he remained ever restless. He experimented with shadow plays, first with Indonesian puppet related ways of doing shadow theatre, but then evolving on it, then also experimenting with films, and then finally moving to magic, off-screen, on-screen, plus shadow, plus film kind of collaborative acts. And Shankar's ever restless urge to mobilize his everyday realities in his creative dance seems to have been pushed to work with embodied creative possibilities. It is helpful to think of this restlessness as a product of his transcultural exposure. These experiments with human movements, stage, lights, film, scenography, and magic create a space for Shankar within the cultural history specific modernity in India, as his work leads to a range of performance processes and products which may be seen as diverse experimentations and life projects where nothing remains static or stable. I will just end with these two videos. Have I gone over time?